to the north of hills, we could get up to 17, 18 degrees easily, and even where it's cloudy and dull, temperatures in the mid-teens. That rain will trickle a little further south through this evening, perhaps into parts of northwest England and northwest Wales. Further south, it generally stays dry overnight, but again, it's likely to turn quite misty and murky, and it will be another very, very mild night. That rain, though, still around as we head into Saturday morning. Could be a bit of a dull, damp start tomorrow across southern Scotland and Northern Ireland. It will push back further north through the day, so after a respite across the northwest, maybe turning damp here come the afternoon, although the rain won't be as heavy by then. Elsewhere tomorrow, many places dry, but it could be quite, as I say, a murky old start, some mist and even a bit of fog around. Could take a while to clear. If it does stick around, well, temperatures are still likely to get into the teens, so it's far from chilly. But where we see a bit of sunshine, temperatures up to 18, 19, perhaps even 20 Celsius. The winds will be lighter tomorrow. That continues into Sunday, when again, most places will be dry, but fairly cloudy or misty.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation. We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online. Across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Every Friday and Sunday night from 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
We're on the same page again. There's something weird happening.
Let Ian finish. Don't be such a cranky.
That mini budget was the tip of the iceberg.
And on Saturday, my show just got bigger. From 8, it's Mark Dolan's Saturday Night In.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak. Stop talking.
My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for The Briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, The Briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Today we explore a remarkable advance of the Ukrainian army in Ukraine. Could this war be being brought to an end? Also, the United Kingdom economy is contracting. What can be done? And are the police ignoring the Home Secretary's advice to get tougher on groups like Extinction Rebellion? We'll explore it all after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The Chancellor's warning there's a tough road ahead, saying difficult decisions will be needed to restore confidence and economic stability. Jeremy Hunt's set to unveil his tax and spending plans next week in the autumn statement. It comes as the latest data for the Office for National Statistics shows the UK economy contracted by 0.2% between July and September. The former Chancellor says he warned Liz Truss she was going too fast with her economic plans. Kwasi Kwarteng told Talk TV he told the former Prime Minister to slow down before being sacked as Chancellor. He's refused to apologise for the financial turmoil after September's mini-budget, but says he does regret the turbulence it caused. People across the UK will this morning mark Armistice Day with a 2-minute silence. Bells will ring out across the country, including the recently restored Big Ben in London at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month to mark the end of World War I. President Volodymyr Zelensky says his forces have reclaimed 41 settlements abandoned by Russia as Ukrainian troops continue their advance through the south of the country. Russian-installed officials have been evacuating residents from the strategic Kherson region. It's after Moscow ordered its forces to withdraw from the Russian-held pocket, including Kherson, in one of the biggest retreats of the Ukrainian conflict so far. And Just Stop Oil has suspended its protest on the M25. The climate protesters say they're stopping to give the government time to consider their responsibilities to the country. They've held up the busy motorway for 4 out of 5 days this week, causing disruption for motorists and leading to multiple arrests. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to The Briefing with Tom.
Good morning, my name's Tom Harwood, it's 9:33 and this is The Briefing here on GB News. First today, some international news. There have been some remarkable developments this morning and overnight in Ukraine. In Kherson, a city in the south of Ukraine to the west of the Dnieper River, a city that Russia has claimed as annexed in September. Well, this annexation seems to be collapsing as I speak. Yesterday, Russia announced it was withdrawing from Kherson, a claim that was treated by many with suspicion. But could it have been a trap? Well, this morning it looks far from an organised masterstroke trap by the Russian army. It's instead a humiliating defeat for them. At least 10 settlements on the edge of Kherson have been liberated by the Ukrainian army, and there are reports of further advances too. War Studies professor Mike Martin reports that while Russia announced it was withdrawing, it did not tell its own troops, causing chaos on the ground. According to Martin, Russian sources were last night saying around 20,000 Russians were stuck in a pocket on the wrong side of the river, unable to retreat as crossing points had been taken out by Ukraine. In short, Ukraine is once again advancing, cutting off Russian troops, and is now very close to liberating all of its territory to the west of the Dnieper River. Well, let's explore this impressive advance and indeed the general state of the war now with Lord Richard Dannett, the former head of the British Army. Lord Dannett, thank you for joining us this morning. It is remarkable to see the scale of what is going on in Kherson. Of course, many of these reports are unconfirmed at this stage, but it seems like the Russians are once again messing this up.
Yes, I think that's right. I think, Tom, we've got to put it in the widest perspective. the original Russian plan, going back to earlier in the year, had been to capture Kherson, which they did, and then push through Mykolaiv towards Odessa to threaten Moldova. And that was what they really wanted to do. Well, frankly, that has failed. And we've seen over recent months the Ukrainian strength building. We saw their remarkable counterattack in Kharkiv in the north, and we've seen the significant progress that they've made in Kherson. Now, what we saw a couple of days ago was this rather extraordinary performance between the Russian commander and the defense minister going through a rather choreographed discussion on television when the permission was given to withdraw from Kherson. So that's the Russian plan, and I think that's what they intend to do. They, if they can pull it off, would like to withdraw their forces to east of the Dnipro River and then really hold that fortified position. Now, the big question is, can they actually do that? Because, as you're reporting this morning, Ukrainian forces are pressing forward, albeit cautiously, liberated some 10, 12 villages in the last 36 hours. And there is the strong prospect that 15, 20,000 Russian troops are still on the west bank of the Dnipro River, and that the Russians may have a real problem in getting them back over the river. Many of the bridges have been dropped by Ukrainian artillery, so the Russians may be forced to using barges and floating ferries to try and get those troops across. Now, here's a question. Will the Ukrainians pause and allow that to happen, or will they follow up really hard and fast with artillery and infantry and armour and aim to capture those 20,000 soldiers? They may well do that. Then there's the wider issue, is all this a trap? Actually, I don't think it is a trap as such. I think it is a logical withdrawal on the part of the Russians to a much more defensible position on the east side of the Dnipro River. However, Kherson, the city itself, is on the west side. I have no doubt at all that the Russians, as they withdraw, are preparing booby traps, mines, every possible device to make life impossible in Kherson. Bear in mind, they've moved out 70,000 of the civilians, probably mostly originally Russian-speaking and Russian-focused civilians. So Kherson is probably going to become, quite shortly, in Ukrainian hands, but frankly, a ghost city.
Yes, and I suppose that follows the Russian playbook in many other parts of the world where, frankly, they flatten places rather than hand them over, or indeed flatten them to take them. But what does this say about where the war is going? Because, of course, winter is setting in, and if there's one lesson that we must have learnt in the last 200 years of fighting in this part of the world, it's that winter is where invasions or counter-invasions really get stuck in Russia or indeed in Ukraine. Should we learn the lessons of what happened in the 1940s and indeed what happened in Napoleon's escapades in this part of the world as well? Things will basically freeze, things will basically stay still until it gets a bit warmer.
Tom, you're right. You're mostly right. But I think there's one other aspect of this. The change seasons, autumn and spring, are the wet seasons, when this very open country becomes extraordinarily muddy and very difficult to move in. And that's what they're going through at the present moment. I think it's miserable to be a soldier in either the Russian or the Ukrainian army at the present time. Even more miserable in the Russian army because the Ukrainians have got better boots, they've got better equipment, they've got better wet weather clothing. So the Ukrainians are suffering less than the Russians are in this very wet and muddy conditions. Now, in a few weeks, a month or so's time, the temperature will drop, the ground will harden up again, and manoeuvre will be possible. It won't be much fun because it'll be blooming cold, ice and snow, but those who have got better equipment will be able to move more easily. I think, though, what is going to happen around Kherson is that on that front, things are going to solidify quite shortly. The Russians will adopt well-defended positions on the east bank of the Dnipro River, 200-300 meters wide. The Ukrainians will struggle to get through Kherson itself because of all the obstacles and the mines. And then they've got the major problem, do they or don't they try an assault river crossing across the Dnipro to attack the Russians? Personally, well, I know that will be an extraordinarily difficult phase of war, very difficult operation of war. It will cause huge casualties. And I think that the Ukrainians will pause long and hard before doing that. If they want to continue their offensive, they would be better, in my view, to continue it in the north of the country, getting into the Donbass that way, and maybe over time trying to get behind the Russians again in their well-defended position on the Dnipro River.
Yes, and sort of pushing down, I suppose, in an encircling movement. It would be fascinating, absolutely fascinating to watch. And just finally, I suppose it is remarkable that we're talking about this sort of warfare stuck in the mud on the 11th of November. I wonder how reminiscent it might be, perhaps, thankfully less so, of course, the war that kicked off all of our remembrance activities in this country more than 100 years ago now.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking a huge question there, and as you can see from what I'm wearing, I'm shortly about to go to the Norwich City War Memorial, where I'm going to lay a wreath on behalf of the Royal British Legion at 11 o'clock. So that's what happens today. Now, you're absolutely right to say that a lot of this started in the mud, particularly the mud of Passchendaele in 1917. But without being lengthy about this, by 1918, the British and Allied forces had worked out how to operate on the Western Front at the end of the First World War. They had learned to integrate armour and infantry moving together, integrated with artillery fire, and that became very successful. Now, in the war in Ukraine, what we're seeing is the Ukrainians, with a lot of Western influence, are using the same sort of techniques of integrating their weapon systems very effectively. The Russians are falling back on their time-honoured methods of heavy artillery and poor bloody infantry. And frankly, I don't spare much. Well, I feel sorry for the Russian soldiers. They don't want to be there. It's their leadership that's completely ruined the peace of Europe and ruining the lives of hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. That's where we are today.
Well, Lord Dannatt, I will let you get on and get to that very important wreath-laying ceremony, of course. Thank you for making the time of today, of all days, for joining us here on the briefing this morning. Lord Richard Dannatt, of course, former head of the British Army. Well, now, moving on, one of these protest groups, one of these environmentalist groups, have this morning announced that they're suspending their activities on the M25 following 4 days of disruption. But the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has already warned the police that they need to get tougher on these environmentalist activists who block roads, vandalise buildings, or indeed smash windows. On Wednesday, an officer riding a motorbike was hurt after a collision with 2 lorries during a roadblock because of the actions of one activist. And this morning, the Daily Mail asks, what is the point in these police? This, of course, after 17 police officers stood aimlessly in the face of one lone protester shutting down the M25. Well, what is the point in these police? I'm delighted to be joined now by former Scotland Yard detective Peter Bleksley. And I suppose you understand how the frustration of so many people. We've seen in our GB News People's poll today, less than 10% of the public are supportive of the actions of the people blocking these roads. Why is it that 17 officers can stand there sort of twiddling their thumbs as an entire motorway gets blocked?
It's a dreadful image on the front of the Daily Mail today. And I think the headline is asking the right question. What is the point? I know from my experience, if I'd been a uniformed officer standing around there actually doing nothing, I would have been massively frustrated. And I would have said to my sergeant or my inspector, what's going on? What's the point of us being here? What are we supposed to be doing here? We're valuable, highly trained public servants, and we want to actually be doing something that is of use. These pointless, brainless, selfish demonstrations by Just Stop Oil, of course, have created horrendous congestion on the motorway and inconvenience for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and I'm glad they've stopped today. That is one small crumb of comfort. But Suella Braverman this week, when she talks about wanting to see old-fashioned policing, I think is hinting very heavily that get up on those gantries and get them off and get the traffic moving.
But it's interesting, politicians have been reticent to get involved in the operational decisions of the police. The police are operationally independent, and politicians, and indeed the government, is always very careful to say, well, of course, the police are independent, we don't want political interference. Where are we in that line? At what point does the Home Secretary really need to spell it out in plain English, that they need to be a bit tougher?
Well, I think if the police are tone deaf to all the messages, not only coming from the politicians, but also from the public in huge numbers, as your poll has so clearly demonstrated, then there's an even greater worry. They must be alert to the feeling amongst the nation, vast swathes of the nation, that we want our police to be policing. And that's coming from the Home Secretary through to the general public. They want to see robust, swift, effective policing. And there are green shoots. Because if we take Stephen Watson, for example, the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, who's dragged them out of special measures in a relatively short amount of time and has refocused on standards, uniform, behaviour, and also every burglary victim being visited. And look what's happened in a very short space of time. Lo and behold, detection figures for burglary have gone up by 52% in Greater Manchester. So who would have thought that if a police officer turns up and investigates a crime, they're going to be more likely to solve it?
So much of this now is about leadership within the police. How can that be reflected across the country?
Well, there is a problem because so many senior police leaders these days have been in the police for 20, 25 years or so, and they've been part of this generation of policing that have said everything in the past is bad, everything we come up now with and in the future is good. Well, of course, Suella Braverman has really kind of challenged that this week by saying she wants old-fashioned policing. But you know what? There's no old-fashioned coppers left in the corridors of policing power these days. So, should the Home Secretary want to call upon many, many thousands of retired police officers who are not blind to the sins of the past, not at all, are visionaries, but remember what was good, what was effective, what worked, what gained public trust and confidence, then I know there's thousands of them would be willing to sit around the table with a cup of tea for free.
Really, really interesting stuff. Well, let's see if this new impetus gets reflected more widely in the police force as the weeks and months go on. But for now, Peter Blexley, thank you so much for joining us here on the briefing this morning. Now, next today, as we briefly touched on there with Lord Dannett, it is Armistice Day, which marks the signing of the secession of World War I between the Allies and Germany at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. Well, in London, the day is marked by the striking of Big Ben, preceded by the quarter bells. And our GB News national reporter, Ellie Costello, joins us now with more.
Well, good morning to you, Tom, on the 11th day of the 11th month, otherwise known as Armistice Day. And it was this day 104 years ago when the First World War officially came to an end. And today here in Westminster at 11 a.m, it's hoped that we're going to hear Big Ben strike 11 times. Now, that has been a very rare sound over the past 5 years because there has been a huge restoration project on the Elizabeth Tower behind me. It's cost £80 million, but it is finally finished, and it's hoped that if all goes well today at 11 o'clock exactly, we will hear Big Ben toll 11 times, and they have been rehearsing since Tuesday, so hopefully that all goes well at 11 o'clock today. But this year's Armistice Day, Tom, is particularly poignant because 104 years on from the end of World War I, many people will feel as though war is a very long way ago, a long time in history, but that's not the case. With the war in Ukraine, war is still very much going on. Conflicts are still taking place. People are losing their lives for their country. And that is exactly what the Foreign Secretary has been saying in his message this morning. James Cleverly has asked the British public to remember Ukraine's fight for freedom, and we're going to see him attend an Armistice Day service alongside Emmanuel Macron today in Paris, and there will be services all over the country and indeed the world today. And it is going to be a poignant Armistice Day as well, because it is the first one without Her Majesty the Queen, the head of the armed forces. And for many veterans, it's going to feel particularly personal for them today. And I'm sure they're going to be thinking about Her Majesty in that 2-minute silence. One of those people is Clive Jones. Now, he is a blind army veteran. He served in Northern Ireland. He's a former Welsh guardsman, and he was actually blinded in an attack on his 26th birthday. He's an incredible man, very brave. And I spoke to him yesterday about what Armistice Day means for him.
As a veteran on Armistice Day, I feel in some respects extremely proud to have served and served my country. But on other sides, I do actually feel quite sad and lonely in some respects, because I do think back of those who I've lost, and I do think of their family and friends that are grieving, especially on days like today. A 2-minute silence for me is very important. I think of, first and foremost, my great uncle Richard, who was a Second World War veteran, served in Normandy, and sadly passed away in 1994. Obviously, there are members of my former regiment and friends that I have lost since, and I do think of them as well, and the family and friends that are also suffering as well at this time. I'm extremely proud to be a veteran, yes. It's gone from being a serving soldier and the camaraderie and everything that came with it, so actually, when you think of it, being a veteran, nothing much has changed. We still get the help from charities and organisations such as the Royal British Legion, and the camaraderie that you spend with veterans in your local community, especially on weekends such as this, is remarkable.
Well, thank you to Ellie Costello for that piece, and indeed Clive Jones, the Welsh guardsman we heard speaking at the end there. Well, finally today, the Office for National Statistics has announced that the United Kingdom's economy contracted by 0.2% in the months July to September this year. What does it all mean, and are we really headed for the longest recession on record? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Andrew Lillico, Director of Europe Economics. And Andrew, is this what you were expecting from the ONS this morning?
I think that the recession seemed very likely at this point. You have high inflation and obviously very high energy costs, and that's been feeding through the economy for a little while, so we should have expected that the economy would be contracting. If anything, 0.2% is pretty mild at this stage.
And yet, probably the most damaging aspect of what the Bank of England forecast a couple of weeks ago now was the length of this recession. Probably quite shallow, but very, very long. And it seems that the United Kingdom government has abandoned many of the pro-growth measures that the Truss administration put forward, not just the tax cuts, but the supply-side reform packages as well. Is there any hope for the future, really, when it comes to getting out of this recession, curtailing this recession to be as short as it possibly could be?
Yes, I don't think one should take those particular Bank of England projections all that literally. I think one of the things that they were indicating there was that was the very long recession you would get if interest rates rose in the way that markets were expecting them to do. But the Bank of England was trying to signal that interest rates aren't going to go up nearly as high as markets are anticipating. So I think that you should expect that the recession, there'll be a nasty recession, but I don't think it's going to go anything as long as the Bank of England indicates, because they just won't raise interest rates that high. So inflation will come down quicker. In terms of looking further ahead, well, there's two kinds of things I think to think about there. One is growth type of measures, and the other is the fiscal consolidation that we're about to have from Hunt and Sunak in a couple of weeks. So there's a link between these three things. Normally, you would say the time for doing a fiscal consolidation would be at least after your recession was complete, if not once the recovery was well underway. So your viewers may remember that in 2010, there was a bit of a debate about whether even 2010 was too early to start for having a major fiscal consolidation.
And of course, the economy was growing in 2010.
That's right, but the economy was already growing in 2010. So people were saying, well, although it's been growing for a year, that's not enough because we should be able to get ourselves all the way back to recovery before we do things. On this occasion, people are talking about having significant tax rises right during the recession, which is very, very unusual as an idea. So I think that the right time for scheduling tax rises and spending cuts, and we will need some of those looking further ahead. We should be out a year or 2 years' time. I think that some of the discussions about having massive tax rises next April are all a little bit unnecessary. And one reason they're unnecessary is because the fiscal situation, it's awkward, but it isn't that bad. I mean, we're talking about, there's talk of a black hole of something of the order of 2% of GDP, even if you believe in that particular black hole. Well, if you went back to 2010, the structural deficit was about 8.8% of GDP, well over 4 times as big. So we're talking about kind of ordinary levels of awkward fiscal consolidation to need to do on this occasion. I think that there's quite a bit of unnecessary pessimism about the longer term growth outlook for the economy as well. I think there are quite a few reasons to suppose that growth looking further ahead will be faster than it's been over the past 12 years or so. And if your growth is faster, then you don't need to have as much tax rises and spending cuts because the growing economy will give you extra tax revenues. And reasons to think that things might be a little bit faster would include things like, I think that we've been stuck because of the Great Recession by having extremely low interest rates and debt kept in place. It were very good reasons why we didn't allow natural adjustments at the time, but the increased inflation and higher interest rates should shock us out of some of our Great Recession malaise. We've had a little bit of a drag on the economy whilst we adjusted to leaving the European Union. So there's been some Brexit adjustment costs. I think those are more than half done, and that gives us a chance to get into some of the gain phase. We won't hopefully have the kind of in and outs that we had for COVID, which has been very disruptive for the economy.
So even without a big agenda of supply-side reform, some of the structure of the United Kingdom economy as it stands might well be putting us onto greener pastures in the medium to long term, if not, sadly, the short term. That's really, really interesting. And I suppose lucky whoever wins the 2024 election, they'll be able to mop up some of those gains. But for now, Andrew Lillico, thank you for joining us here on The Briefing. It's the end of the show, I'm afraid. But up next, it's Esther and Phil with This Morning here on GB News. Catch them for the next 2 hours. That's it for me. I'm back on Monday.
Good morning. I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update. Another day where you may want to check the calendar as you step out the door this morning because it is very, very mild out there. Quite blustery and quite cloudy.